Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we are opening a doorway straight into the Middle Ages, a time when people didn't just live with plagues and wars, but also faced phenomena so bizarre that if they happened today, you'd probably start live streaming, call the police, call a shaman, and maybe even call your ex just to confirm you weren't hallucinating. Before we begin our journey tonight, if you enjoy mysterious historical stories told in a lighthearted yet chilling way, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next discoveries. And hey, don't hesitate to leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I always love seeing that our community comes from all around the world. Now, dim the lights, sit back comfortably, and let the sound of the fan and a bit of background music draw you into the atmosphere of a mysterious medieval night. Watch until the end of the video, because I believe the things people in the Middle Ages once witnessed will make you question whether history is hiding something much bigger from us. When we talk about the Middle Ages, we often imagine solemn religious ceremonies, knights in shining armor, and peaceful monasteries isolated from the world. But if you lived in that time, your life wouldn't just be about farming, cooking soup, and staying away from the plague. Every few months, the universe decided to send people a surprise gift, the kind of gift that made the whole village gasp and the monks immediately opened their books to start recording. And at the top of the list of the strangest things were the birth anomalies that looked as if the gods themselves had shaped them in a very unhappy mood. Imagine this. You just woke up thinking about whether to fix the fence or brew beer today when a terrified scream erupts from the cow barn. When you run over, you see the entire neighbor's family gathered around a newborn calf, but it doesn't look like any calf you've ever seen. Instead of one head, it has two. One looking to the left as if judging your entire family lineage, the other glancing to the right as if preparing to file a complaint. Everyone holds their breath. Children hide behind their mother's skirts. The elders make the sign of the cross so many times their wrists crack. No one knew anything about genetic mutations or developmental abnormalities. No one had the scientific knowledge to say this was just a biological accident. To the villagers, it was a reminder that the divine was watching and possibly displeased. They began whispering, "Did someone do something wrong? Did someone touch the sacred tree? Or worse, did someone steal Gerald's chickens?" One group believed the two-headed creature was a good omen, signaling a bountiful harvest. The other believed it was a warning, a kind of medieval email sent directly from heaven. Fix your ways. And in the middle were a few practical people who wanted badly to say, maybe it's just an unusual calf. But they stayed silent because they didn't want to be accused of denying miracles and be forced to fast for a month. While the villagers argued, monks from the nearby monastery rushed over faster than any delivery service. They saw this as an important event, something to record in black ink with solemn illustrations. Their drawings were often so serious that the odd creature looked more like a monster from a prophecy book than a trembling, hungry calf. In the year of our Lord, a two-headed creature appeared, signaling turmoil, a single caption that could stir up panic in the whole town. The truth was, the calf just wanted milk. But in the Middle Ages, its existence became breaking news, no different from a trending social media topic. People gossiped, speculated, and some even blamed Margaret just because she smiled at a crow the day before, which, according to the unwritten rules of the time, was a suspicious act. When the villagers gradually got used to biological oddities, nature decided to upgrade the strangeness. One night, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through narrow cracks, dark clouds twisted as if threatening to swallow the sky, and then the church bell tower burst into a blue flame. A faint, shimmering halo, like a will-o'-the-wisp but brighter, enveloped the top of the tower, and in those brief seconds the whole village froze. No one screamed. No one ran. They just stared and feared. For us today, that phenomenon has a name, St. Elmo's fire, a kind of plasma created by strong electric fields. But to medieval people, it was a direct message from the supernatural realm. One group fell to their knees, believing an angel was shining upon them. Another ran into their homes, locked the doors, burned incense, and hoped they hadn't accidentally offended the heavens. A few brave or reckless souls touched objects that were glowing, only to get a small static shock and run away screaming that a mystical power just passed through them. If you think only common villagers believed in such things, you're mistaken. Even priests sometimes had no idea what was happening, but they knew one thing. Any phenomenon that felt supernatural was an opportunity to preach, warn, and encourage people to live more virtuously. So the next morning, the sermon always began with, "Last night we were sent a sign," and the villagers would nod, silently thinking, "I wonder who messed up this time." Then came the bird migration season, when people witnessed a spectacle that would be rare even today. Millions of birds flew in dense formations, covering the sky so completely that the ground fell into shadow as if a solar eclipse were happening. Imagine you're working in the field, the daylight suddenly disappears, and you look up to see the sky transformed into a moving black mass. You'd probably think the end of the world was peeking over the horizon. Those massive flocks didn't just overwhelm the villagers, they convinced them that the heavens were sending a message. Some believed it was the army of God. Some believed it was a warning of disaster. Others were completely convinced that the birds were the souls of the dead searching for shelter. Overall, life in the Middle Ages was like a long series of mysterious nature, new update available. Every phenomenon, even if entirely natural, turned into a mystical story, a prophecy, or proof of intervention from invisible forces. And when you live in a world without scientific explanations, every light, every sound, every creature could be a message from the universe. After all the bizarre phenomena mentioned above, skies darkened by swarming birds, berserker warriors roaring like caffeinated thunder, or red rain falling as if the heavens had been stabbed, the people of the Middle Ages still had more to face. In fact, to them, each week was like a new episode of a strange cosmic series. What does nature want to scare us with today? And on one seemingly harmless morning, while farmers were cleaning barns or airing out bread, the ground suddenly trembled. Not an earthquake. If it were an earthquake, at least they'd have a reason to panic. What they witnessed was something entirely different. A patch of ground moving, rolling by like a living carpet. When it got close enough, they realized it wasn't dirt or stones, but bugs. A sea of bugs, millions of them, thick and densely packed, filling every gap like a biological flood. Sometimes beetles, sometimes locusts, sometimes things that even modern people wouldn't want to name. To medieval people, this was a definite sign that someone, somewhere, had done something terribly wrong, and God responded by sending down a carpet of collective responsibility. Some immediately ran into their houses, slammed the doors, pulled the curtains, and pretended they didn't exist. Others stood staring in horror, trying to figure out if this was some kind of digital simulation disaster, straight out of the Bible. And as usual, the priest stepped forward with the most solemn expression possible, offering an explanation that sounded certain. This is a test of faith. Of course, no one dared ask whether that test really needed to include bugs crawling into their shoes, their clothes, and their soup bowls. But the most striking part was the sound. Millions of tiny wings, tiny legs, tiny bodies rubbing against each other created a noise like rain falling on a roof. If you've never heard the sound of migrating insects, imagine the sky and the ground each having their own volume, and both trying to outdo the other in a contest for most heart-stopping sound of the year. Children screamed. Adults ran in chaos. Chickens completely lost their minds, running in circles as if calculating the best evacuation route. The cows and buffalo stood staring, not understanding what was happening, but clearly disliking it. And then things got worse. The bugs started eating everything at an alarming speed. Crops that villagers spent an entire season nurturing disappeared so quickly it could have been considered a reversed miracle, the kind no one wanted to witness. Some medieval records describe the scene as the land being scraped clean. Others wrote that fields once lush and green now looked like a balding man desperately trying to keep his remaining hair. The monks recorded it again in their chronicles. Although modern geology shows these were natural migration cycles, to them, it was proof that nature was launching the 78th warning campaign of the year. Villagers blamed all sorts of things. Gerald, of course, Margaret the witch, or even that someone didn't contribute enough to the church the previous week. Honestly, whenever anything strange happened, Gerald was always the prime suspect. But the horror didn't stop there. Night fell, and when the villagers were exhausted from battling insects all day like contestants in a medieval survival game, the sun set and the sky began to glow. Not lightning, not shooting stars, but strange, bluish lights swirling and shifting like ribbons draped across the heavens. To modern people, it could be aurora or atmospheric reflections, but to medieval folk, this was a legitimate reason to believe everything was about to end. Mothers clutched their children. Strong men stood frozen. The priest looked up, trying to offer an explanation that wouldn't make the entire village faint. Heavenly light, he said, though he himself wasn't entirely sure angels enjoyed appearing like stage spotlights. Some people ran into cellars, hoping that if the apocalypse happened, they could at least avoid the worst of it. Others watched the light drift across the clouds, whispering that it was the spirits of ancestors returning. And a few practical people simply sighed and said, "Again?" The monks picked up their pens once more. Their records now became a vibrant collection. Fiery wheels in the sky, glowing discs, luminous rings, even streaks of light that looked like a giant warrior swinging a sword across the heavens. To them, these lights were not just natural phenomena. They were symbols of holy stories, omens, or simply something terrifying enough that it absolutely needed to be written down. And when dawn came, the lights vanished, the bugs disappeared, and the sky returned to normal. But the villagers didn't. They woke up feeling that they had just witnessed a cosmic warning. That nature, or the divine, had reminded them that medieval life, already difficult, had just become even harder. However, in true medieval fashion, after a few days, everyone went back to their daily routines, sowing seeds, harvesting, complaining about taxes, and avoiding Gerald. But deep inside, the unease remained. They lived in a world where fear lurked everywhere, not because they were superstitious, but because nature at that time was truly strange. And that was only a small part of the bizarre things medieval people had to endure. If you think that was all, then prepare yourself, because the next stories are even more absurd, more unbelievable, and will definitely make you look at history with completely different eyes. And that was when everyone in the village began to realize something. If there was anything strange enough to make both adults and children scream at the same time, it definitely belonged to medieval Europe. They had seen glowing wood, people spontaneously combusting, green-skinned children emerging from the ground. But no, the universe still wasn't satisfied. Nature wanted to remind them, you haven't seen anything yet. And so it deployed a new prank, animal rain. Imagine you're standing in your yard, about to hang clothes or trying to argue with the neighbor's chicken. The sky suddenly darkens, the wind picks up, and you think, oh, maybe it'll rain. But instead of raindrops falling, you hear thud, thud, as if someone is throwing potatoes off the roof. You look up and instantly realize they're not potatoes. They are fish. Fresh fish flipping their tails in absolute confusion because they can't understand why swimming has suddenly turned into reluctant skydiving. Modern people might pull out their phones, film it in slow motion, and upload it online. Medieval people did the only reasonable thing: scream loudly, run inside, and lock the door as if the fish might knock and ask to come in to escape the rain. The problem is, it wasn't just fish. History records frogs, tadpoles, small snakes, and one particularly chaotic incident: scorpions. Imagine living in a time when you already had to worry about plague, drought, taxes, and suddenly the sky decides to drop scorpions on your head like birthday gifts from hell. Medieval folk saw this and said, I'm going to bed. The universe can deal with itself. Today, science explains this simply. Waterspouts or small tornadoes near bodies of water can suck up lightweight creatures into the air and then drop them elsewhere. But medieval people who didn't know meteorology had one explanation. God is sending a message, or demons are sending a message, or something in the forest is sending a message. In general, they were very certain about the message, but no one knew what the message actually said. And if you think it stopped at small animals, remember that the Middle Ages was where anything could be upgraded into something worse. Some records mention villagers witnessing worm rain. Others swear they saw meat rain, which was likely just chunks of animal tissue blown by the wind. But Medieval people didn't accept realistic explanations. Realistic explanations were too boring. They chose the version, oh, this is a sign of the apocalypse, and the whole village nodded in unison because that was what they did best. There was one particularly interesting case, fish rain that fell only within a single street as if the storm had a peculiar preference. I just like dropping fish here, not anywhere else. Villagers concluded that it was a miracle or a curse, or worse, a cursed miracle. To them, distinguishing these concepts mattered as much as distinguishing a cat from an annoyed cat, meaning not very important, but they felt obligated to do it anyway. And while the villagers panicked, the monks were absolutely thrilled. They grabbed their pens, opened their manuscripts, and recorded every detail with solemn precision as if rewriting the laws of nature. Today, fish fell from the sky. We shall call this phenomenon fish rain. And thus, a strange concept was preserved in history simply because someone was too excited to see fish falling from clouds. In truth, what confused medieval people most wasn't the animals falling, but their behavior. Frogs hopping everywhere as if performing in a show, fish flopping on the ground, staring at people as if asking, "What did you do to put me in this situation?" Some even survived the fall and began wriggling toward water. This made villagers even more certain that the phenomenon had a mystical purpose. After the panic faded, the villagers experienced a fascinating psychological shift: greed. Some thought, if the sky drops fish, then that's free food. And so they started collecting fish, bringing them home, and cooking dinner. For a brief moment, nature managed to terrify them and feed them at the same time. The perfect sorry for scaring you, here's compensation gesture. Of course, some people still refused to touch anything that fell from the sky, believing that illogical food would bring bad luck. Meanwhile, children considered it the greatest event of their lives. Medieval kids had no toys, and the sky dropping frogs was basically a national festival to them. But it didn't stop there. Many villages began recording these events, forming theories, even organizing commemorative days whenever an animal rain occurred. To them, this wasn't nature playing a prank. It was a reminder that the universe always operated mysteriously, sometimes too mysteriously for them to react in time. Modern people understand storms as simple physical phenomena. Medieval people understood very differently. To them, each animal falling from the sky was proof that the world was full of things beyond imagination, that any ordinary day could end with a story bizarre enough to tell for 3 generations. And that is exactly what makes the medieval era special. Not because it was accurate, but because it was wild, chaotic, and full of things that make you wonder, if I lived back then, would I survive even a week? Medieval wild men, or what manuscripts proudly describe as woodwoes, were not mysterious creatures like Bigfoot in modern documentaries. No, this was more like a guy who has lived in the forest way too long, but upgraded tenfold. Villagers believed these beings were the result of nature installing an update patch on itself. When the forest felt humans were too noisy, it created woodwoes to maintain order. And order in the Middle Ages meant chasing everyone out of the woods with a giant club. Imagine you're a farmer gathering firewood. You're already exhausted from avoiding wolves, boars, bandits, and possibly Gerald, who always borrows money and never pays it back. And then, from the thick foliage, something covered in hair, tall as the village gate, steps out. It looks at you with the expression of, "Who allowed you in here?" And you just stand there hugging your bundle of wood, trembling like a student being called on by the teacher. Medieval people described this as the moment they realized the forest didn't belong to humans. It belonged to something that had been annoyed because someone snapped a twig the wrong way. Some claimed they had heard woodwows speak human language, but this was the Middle Ages, where everyone was constantly dehydrated, malnourished, and superstitious enough to think that if a goose honked strangely, it was a sign of war. Maybe the woodwows was simply growling, but medieval imagination translated it into, it's reciting a prophecy. Interestingly, wild men in medieval art were depicted with a strange sense of reverence, partly because they looked terrifying, and partly because villagers thought living away from society might give someone mystical powers. In reality, the truth may have been simpler. They were just reclusive people, very hairy, deficient in vitamin D, and not thrilled to see someone invade their territory. But the medieval world didn't stop at woodwoes. If the forest didn't scare you enough, the sky would take over the job. Because sometimes, among the most ridiculous tales, medieval people encountered something even harder to explain than raining frogs: clouds with suspicious shapes. Not the awe, looks like a cute dragon kind that kids see today. To medieval people who were already stressed, they looked up and saw a cloud that seemed to be looking back. Some records tell of clouds with human heads, others claim to have seen warrior clouds on horseback, and the extreme ones describe a cloud riding another cloud. And instead of sitting down to breathe, they immediately concluded this was a sign of an upcoming war. Or worse, heaven had opened its own VFX studio. These cloud riders made people believe supernatural forces were running military drills. They even debated which side the army belonged to. Some said angels, others insisted demons. An old man in the village claimed it was King Arthur's army returning to check on taxes, and everyone believed the old man because in that era, any elderly person was automatically considered wise. However, the strangest phenomenon wasn't in the sky or the forest, it was right inside churches. Medieval people often told stories of statues that wept or sweated. Today, we know that most of it was caused by humidity, cracks, or natural oil seepage. But to people of that time, who saw ghosts in every flicker of candlelight, this was 100% proof that the spirit world was posting a story. One village panicked for 3 weeks because a saint statue started crying. The monks preached that it was a warning. The villagers tried to guess what the warning was about. Some said famine, some said war. An old lady claimed the statue was crying because her kitchen lost its pot lid. And somehow everyone found her argument reasonable. The issue was, when you live in an era where everything seems dangerous, from the weather to the livestock, any strange occurrence becomes the event of the year. So when the droplets on the statue were eventually discovered to be just morning dew condensation, villagers began blaming each other for panicking too much. They quickly concluded it was Gerald's fault, the same man who still hadn't returned the basket of salt he borrowed last month. But if anything terrified medieval people the most, it was unexplained illness. A mild fever could trigger an emergency village meeting. A strange boil was enough to spark rumors lasting 3 generations. People believed many illnesses were caused by evil spirits, cursed food, or witches sending hexes from afar like demonic SMS messages. Some records tell of a man who had headaches for 3 days, and villagers concluded that his head was occupied by a tiny demon tapping with a hammer. In reality, he was just sleep deprived because his cow mooed too loudly. But that was the Middle Ages. Reality was too boring for their imagination. There were no vaccines, no modern doctors. People only had herbs, prayers, and the hope that the sky wouldn't drop anything new on them while they slept. In a place where anything, from swamp lights to a cat's breath, could become an omen, you begin to understand why medieval people lived in a constant state of stress. And the miracle is that amid all this panic, they still lived, laughed, and recorded the strangest things, so we today can read them with equal parts shivers and laughter. But to truly understand what medieval people considered strange, we have to dive deeper into how they viewed the world. A world where anything beyond their understanding was automatically attributed to demons, magic, or divine punishment. And while we today have Google, LED lights, and a smartphone glued to our hand, they had to confront mysterious phenomena with imaginations so vivid that they were both amusing and, well, reasonable in their own way. One of the most confusing things for people of that time was nature, especially things they had no written records for, or that no one had survived long enough to describe. Imagine you are a farmer living on the edge of a forest so deep that even sunlight needed permission to slip through. You hear strange howls at night, see unusually large footprints on damp soil, and occasionally find livestock disappearing, leaving behind only tufts of fur and a few bone fragments. To you, that wasn't just some weird animal. No, it was the sign of a beast man, a forest spirit, or a hungry ghost. And if you brought the story back to your village, everyone would nod very seriously, as if you had just presented a scientific report. Not only nature, but sky phenomena also made medieval people's hearts stop. Sudden lights, comets, eclipses, all were interpreted as omens. Imagine you are calmly working in the field when the sun suddenly vanishes in the middle of the day. No NASA announcement, no live stream titled Total Eclipse 2025. You have only one thought: the world is ending. And indeed, in historical records, there were entire groups of villagers who collapsed to the ground, begging for forgiveness, or hugging one another, believing the final disaster had arrived. But what astonished medieval people the most were social phenomena, human behaviors that today are normal but were once seen as confusing or even possessed. For example, laughing too much. Yes, there was a time when monks wrote in manuscripts that uncontrollable laughter could be a sign of a demon invading someone's mind. If you fell into a laughter outbreak like a modern comedy show, you could be detained for exorcism. Another thing that frightened people was individuals with unusual appearances. In modern society, we have genetics, pathology, and morphology, but medieval people had none of these. A very tall person was believed to be a descendant of giants. A very short person was considered cursed in the womb. Even people with extraordinary memory were suspected of making deals with the other world. One of the most interesting records from the manuscripts described how villagers reacted when they first encountered new technologies and believed them to be magical. When mechanical clocks appeared, many people believed the gears inside were powered by imprisoned spirits. A clock that ticked away 12 hours? Oh no, it was whispering the curse of time. Some villages even banned clocks from churches, thinking they would distort prayers. Even more frightening were diseases, especially strange symptoms they had no way of explaining. Someone suddenly convulsing, demon possession. Someone with a high fever and delirium, witch's curse. Someone erupting in red rashes, definitely the wrath of a forest spirit. Anything that today we categorize as medical science was considered mystical and terrifying to them. And because of that, medieval people lived in constant fear of not knowing what would happen, not understanding the cause, and having no control over it. But what confused them is also what makes the Middle Ages so fascinating: the blend of imagination and the effort to explain the world. They didn't have scientific foundations, but they had storytelling skills, interpretations, and the ability to weave legends so vivid that they lasted for centuries. To them, every strange thing was a story. A wild man was a symbol of untamed nature. A distorted mirror was a doorway to another world. A natural phenomenon was a warning from above. And while these stories may seem funny to us today, they reveal something beautiful. Humans in any era want to understand the world. They just explain it differently. And within these strange tales, we see a bit of ourselves: fear, curiosity, and the desire to find meaning in the unexplainable. The Middle Ages were not as dark as we think. They were an era of boundless imagination, a time when a single strange shadow passing through the forest could shake an entire village. The clash between the two entourages happened so quickly that no one had time to understand what was going on. Shouts erupted through the dusty road. The harsh clang of metal collided with the frantic tugging of horses' reins. The travelers, long accustomed to staying far away from the conflicts of the powerful, immediately jumped into ditches or scattered into the nearby bushes. And in those few chaotic moments, Rome was changed forever. Clodius, once considered the ruler of the streets, no longer hid behind the crowds as he usually did. He stood there, right at the center of the storm he had spent years creating. There were no more cheering chants, no more streets packed with supporters, only dust, weapons clashing, and the heavy breathing of men who had survived by feeding on the fear of others. But today, that fear had turned around and was hunting them. Milo, calm and cold as a general stepping out of a battlefield, didn't say a word. He didn't need to shout or intimidate anyone. His presence, along with his infamous band of gladiators always at his side, was enough to turn the scene into a death sentence for anyone who dared challenge him. When the blades flashed, Milo didn't go for Clodius right away. He let his men do what they had trained for their whole lives: divide the enemy, isolate the target, and crush the opposing force with ruthless precision. Amid the chaos, Clodius was wounded. A cut to the shoulder or the thigh, sources differ. But all accounts agree on one thing: he fell from his horse. And in that moment, the power he had built through shouting, anger, and grand marches dissolved like ash. Once he hit the ground, Clodius was no longer a populist leader or a powerful tribune. He was a man scrambling to crawl away from the very conflict he had subjected Rome to for years. His entourage tried to pull him out of the battlefield, but Milo saw the opportunity the Roman elite had been waiting for. The pursuit began. Clodius was taken into a small roadside inn, a humble tavern with rotting wooden walls and a simple thatched roof. It was not a place fit for a political figure, which only made him more vulnerable. His men, panicked and overwhelmed, could not hold back Milo's gladiators, and when the tavern door burst open, everything was essentially decided. No one knows exactly what happened inside. Some sources say Clodius was dragged out, others claim he was killed in the room, but all agree on the outcome. Clodius Pulcher, the man who once shook Rome, was dead in what seemed like a coincidental encounter. His death was not just the end of a man. It was the end of a power structure built on hatred and a license for the chaos he had sown to explode once more. When the news reached Rome, the city did not mourn in silence. Rome exploded. Clodius's supporters flooded the streets, carrying years of pent-up anger. His body was brought back to the city, not with the dignity of a leader, but like a trophy meant to inflame the fury of the masses. And when the corpse was placed in the Forum, once the heart of the Republic, cries roared like thunder. That rage quickly spiraled out of control. The crowd blamed Milo, blamed the Senate, blamed the entire elite who had allowed this rivalry to escalate. They didn't just lament, they burned. The courthouse in the Forum, where Roman law had once been revered, was set ablaze and became a massive inferno. The flames rose like a twisted cymbal, consuming part of the city and the facade that Rome still had order. Milo, victorious on the road, suddenly became the hunted in public opinion. His former supporters whispered about recalculating alliances, fearing they would be dragged into the uncontrollable outrage. Meanwhile, Pompey, Milo's patron, realized that Rome had entered a phase that no gang could control by force alone. In this context, the death of Clodius was not a period but an exclamation mark. It forced Rome to face a question no one dared to say aloud. Who really ruled this city? Not the Senate, not the law, but the men holding clubs, those hired to shout louder, strike harder, and threaten faster. Yet when it seemed Rome would completely explode, one figure, a renowned general, stepped forward to restore order, even at the cost of breaking what remained of the Republic. Pompey was granted unprecedented powers: authority over security forces, the right to summon troops, and the power to stabilize the city however he saw fit. The confrontation between Clodius and Milo ultimately did more than kill one man. It shattered Rome's mask, revealing a raw truth: the Republic was dying. And as Pompey stepped onto the stage with new powers, the first bricks of dictatorship were put into place. Rome had gone quiet after the storm, but it was not the silence of a city recovering. It was the silence of a beast gasping for breath, having survived a battle yet unsure whether it had the strength to rise again. On the stone-paved streets, burn marks still spread like unhealed wounds. The rooftops were still stained with soot, and in the air people could feel something heavy lingering, a warning that the recent turmoil was not the end. When the Praetorian Guard marched into the city with their steady footsteps, Rome neither cheered nor protested. The people simply stood still, watching, a kind of silence mixed with hope and fear. They knew these soldiers were not like the lawless gangs from before, nor like the senators who only argued on the Forum. The Praetorians appeared as a new kind of authority, one they did not yet know whether to love or to fear. But they understood one thing clearly: everything had changed. Pompey from afar observed the process of restoring order, a task he had just been granted. He did not need to be present on every street. His name alone was enough to make the whole city bow. And in Rome's silence, Pompey realized something the Senate didn't dare say aloud. He now held more power than anyone since the days of the Etruscan kings. The only difference was that this time, it was the Senate itself that had handed him this power, like a desperate man giving a sword to the only one strong enough to wield it. In the days that followed, Rome was like a patient recovering from emergency surgery. The violence was halted, but the wounds left behind were still deep and wide. The slums, once the domain of the Clodius and Milo gangs, were now searched corner by the Praetorians. Those who had once ruled their neighborhoods now bowed their heads, fled, or begged. No one was forgiven. No one was exempt. Rome's new order was not based on debate, but on military discipline and fear. Yet within this iron-fisted control, a new sense of order began to emerge. Markets reopened, though cautiously. Bakers returned to their morning ovens. Fruit sellers stood once more on their stone steps, calling out with trembling voices. Families who had kept their doors shut for weeks finally dared to open their windows to let in sunlight. Still, this life was fragile, like a candle in the wind. Everyone knew that just one more spark could plunge Rome back into chaos. The Senate, although protected by the Praetorians, met in fear. The Curia Hostilia had been burned to ashes, leaving a hollow emptiness in the square, a symbol reminding everyone that the most sacred power of the Republic could be destroyed in a single afternoon of rage. Senators now sat in a hastily erected building, but none could forget the crash of collapsing beams or the red-orange glow reflected on the faces of the arsonists. After that event, no one underestimated the power of the mob ever again. But from that same fear, a new unspoken agreement emerged. They would accept Pompey, at least for now. And Pompey, once seen as the hero who conquered the East, now became their savior. Even though they knew that this salvation came at the cost of surrendering the Republic's remaining power, piece by piece. At this point, people began to speak of the future, not with hope, but with caution. For everyone realized that the order brought by the Praetorians was not the order of the past. It was the order of a new age, one in which the army stood in the very heart of the city, and every decision had to consider whether Pompey would approve. In the months following Milo's exile, Rome began to recover. But within that recovery was a subtle yet profound change. For the first time, Romans felt safe because of the army, not because of the law. It was a dangerous reversal, a precedent that history would later pay for in blood, but at that moment it was welcomed by the people. In their eyes, any force capable of preventing Rome from collapsing into chaos was a savior. Pompey understood this well, and he also understood that the recent turmoil had opened up a massive power vacuum, a vacuum that, if he did not fill, someone else surely would, someone who might burn Rome even faster than Clodius. But what Pompey did not expect was this. Far away, someone else was watching. Someone who had once been his ally, once his friend, once a man who shared victories with him. Someone whose ambition never slept. That man was Gaius Julius Caesar. And when Rome summoned Pompey back to restore order, Caesar would see something deeply troubling. Pompey had become the most powerful man in Rome, the most fearsome man in Rome, and perhaps no longer the man Rome once knew. Rome had returned to peace, but it was not a sign of an ending. It was a sign that a greater, more dangerous, more inevitable confrontation was beginning to take shape. When a rider placed his foot on the first trail of the Pony Express, he wasn't simply stepping into a job, he was diving straight into America's time machine. This journey wasn't the glamorous adventure of Wild West legends. It was a brutally honest trial by endurance. From Missouri out toward the Nebraska plains, the cold wind slashed across faces like shards of glass, while the sun hung high above, scorching everything in sight. The horse galloped, hooves striking the hard ground in panic, while the rider clung to the saddle with nothing but raw survival instinct. They knew that one slip could mean never returning from this nameless stretch of land. Yet even the harshness of nature couldn't compare to the loneliness. Along the 1,800-mile route, there were no neighbors, no shops, no law, only wind, silence, and death lurking in the shadows. Pony Express didn't demand courage, it demanded acceptance of a truth: you might never come back. Once past the open plains, riders entered the territory of native tribes, a place where military tension, distrust, and decades of conflict turned each rustling branch into a possible death sign. Many riders said they never forgot that feeling, a chill down their spine as they entered valleys so silent that even birds seemed to avoid them. They knew they might be watched. And they were. Many tribes saw the Pony Express as a threat encroaching on their ancestral lands. To them, it was a symbol of a growing force pushing deeper into the West and disrupting the fragile balance that had lasted for generations. But that danger was part of what made the Pony Express legendary. One young rider, only 17, once said he saw shadows moving on the hillsides during 2 hours of riding. They didn't shoot. They didn't attack. They just watched, as if to see whether that tiny human would tremble or continue forward in hopeless determination. And he did continue, because the male could not stop. When night fell, darkness on the frontier became another enemy. The Pony Express had no rest hours, no safe nighttime, no, we'll handle it tomorrow. Night was a thick black void where horses had to navigate by instinct, and riders stared into an empty horizon, unsure what awaited them: a trap, a ravine, or an arrow slicing through the air. Even moonlight often wasn't enough to guide them, especially during the sandstorms in Utah, where people said you could scream and not hear your own voice. But none of those trials compared to the Sierra Nevada, the Pony Express's final gatekeeper. Frozen, treacherous mountains so tall they seemed to block out the sky. There, horses slipped easily, riders lost their sense of direction, and the wind bit into skin like teeth. Riders fought not only nature, but the limits of human endurance. Some nights, snowfall buried entire paths, leaving both man and horse nearly blind. But the mail still had to go. The nation was on the brink of civil war. Every hour of delay could change its fate. And in that skin-cutting cold, occasionally they saw the faint glow of a relay station, where a weary station keeper waited, eyes sunken from lack of sleep but never leaving his post. They switched horses without even speaking. Just one word: ready. Then the rider dashed off again, carrying with him the only warmth, the fleeting shelter he had just left behind. But the Pony Express wasn't only about danger. It was about speed, a kind of speed America had never seen. News from the East Coast reached the West Coast in under 2 weeks, so fast that many in California thought it was a miracle. But that miracle came at a high cost. Behind the heroic stories were countless tragedies lost to time. Many riders disappeared without a trace. People found only the horse, or sometimes just the saddle. Some stations were burned during periods of conflict between settlers and tribes. Some nights, the wind carried a scream from somewhere far off, but when the station keeper went to check, there was nothing left but footprints nearly erased by the wind. In a way, the Pony Express was its own battlefield, where courage and recklessness were paid for with youth. So why did they do it? For honor? For high pay? For patriotism? Perhaps a little of all three. But the biggest reason was that they were frontier people, those who believed America's destiny depended on linking its two coasts. They believed in a vision that when information traveled faster, division could be healed, or at the very least, the nation would know where it was heading. In the end, the Pony Express lasted only 18 months, but its impact lived on. It became a symbol of speed, bravery, and resilience during a moment when an entire nation stood on the edge of collapse. And most importantly, it proved something America had never admitted before: that sometimes the greatest leaps forward come from the smallest figures, riding dusty horses across places the maps didn't dare to draw. Below is the full English translation, with no additions or removals, exactly as you requested. But extraordinary journeys like these were only a small part of the countless moments when the Pony Express turned young boys into symbols. Along the nearly 3,000-kilometer route, every rider had his own story, a story about a moment when he had to face a life-or-death choice within just a few heartbeats. Those choices, made in absolute solitude, wove the legend of the Pony Express with the rough thread of willpower and courage. Once, a young rider named Johnson, only 17 years old, was ambushed right in the middle of a narrow canyon in Utah. A bullet struck his horse's chest, causing the animal to collapse and nearly pulling the rider down with it. In an instant, Johnson grabbed the mochila and ran across the jagged rocky ground as rounds of gunfire continued to rain down behind him. He ran until his legs bled, until his lungs felt like they were on fire, and only stopped when he saw the flickering yellow light of the next station in the darkness. The station keeper was stunned to see him, clothes torn, knees bruised, but the mailbag still locked. Johnson only said one sentence: "The mail is safe," then collapsed. Not every story was that brutal, but each carried the color of a world only Pony Express riders could understand. A world where survival depended not only on speed, but on quick wits and pure instinct. There were nights so dark that riders couldn't tell the trail from the cliffs. They had to listen to the echo of hoofbeat beats on the ground, feel the vibration in the saddle to know whether they were going the right direction or one step away from death. There were mornings when the rising sun lit up a breathtaking landscape, snow-covered mountain ranges glowing red like fire, herds of buffalo running across distant plains, and cold winds swelling the riders' deerskin coats. Every moment was both beautiful and terrifying, as if they were riding through two worlds at once, the world of the living and the world where death lurked just behind a bend. The job also required something modern people would never think of: the ability to endure absolute loneliness. Riders often traveled dozens of miles without seeing another human being. No one to talk to, no music, no lights. Only the horses breathing, the wind slicing past the ears, and the heartbeat in their chest. Some riders said after days of riding in silence, they began talking to their horses like close friends. It sounds strange, but for them, it was the only way to feel like they still belonged to this world. And then there were moments when danger did not come from nature or people, but from their own bodies. A rider named Harris once said that after finishing a 90-mile stretch in freezing weather, he could no longer feel his hands. When he arrived at the station, he had to use his teeth to pull the mochila off because his fingertips were completely numb. But even then, he insisted on staying long enough to make sure the next rider had received the mochila properly before allowing himself to collapse next to the fire. Sometimes sheer cleverness saved their lives. Another rider, Sam Hamilton, once rode through a forest when he heard another horse closing in behind him. Realizing he was about to be ambushed, Sam dropped his body to one side of the saddle, clinging on with one leg and one arm, his body nearly parallel to the ground. Arrows flew over his head, piercing the spot where he had been sitting seconds before. His horse kept charging like a storm, and Sam held that position for more than 200 meters until he cleared the ambush zone. He reached the station with numb arms, but he still completed his mission. Interestingly, despite their unbelievable bravery, most riders shared one common trait: humility. When asked why they dared take this job, they just shrugged and said, "Because someone has to do it." It was a simple attitude, but one that captured the true spirit of the Pony Express, an organization that existed not for glory, but because the nation needed it, and the nation truly needed them. In a period when the country was fracturing under political tension and preparing to enter civil war, the Pony Express was not just a mail system. It was a lifeline, a nervous system, the way a trembling nation in the dark could still feel its own heartbeat. Thanks to them, people in California knew the country still stood. Thanks to them, the federal government received daily updates on wartime developments. And thanks to them, the feeling of "we are still one" survived during a moment of chaos. Though it existed for only 18 short months, the Pony Express left behind a legacy far greater than its lifespan. Every story of courage, of extraordinary effort, of young boys riding across frontiers with the speed of the wind, all became bricks in the foundation of America's Wild West mythology. Mythology not about guns or shootouts, but about the determination of young people facing challenges the modern world cannot even imagine. The Pony Express was never just about delivering mail. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest burdens are carried by the smallest shoulders. Boys not even old enough to be called men, riding skinny horses through the darkness, carrying the hopes of a nation holding its breath, waiting for news. Here is the complete English translation, with no additions and no omissions, exactly as requested. Dawn slowly lifted its veil across the sky, and Constantinople awoke with a sound unlike any other city on earth. A city that was not merely a place, but a living creature, breathing, resonating, telling its own story through every stone and every footstep. Here, at the intersection of two continents, East and West blended, collided, absorbed one another to create a world that even the most seasoned merchants had to admit was too much to believe with one's own eyes. When the first sunlight touched the golden domes of Hagia Sophia, the city lit up as if it had donned an armor of fire. The golden glow reflected onto narrow canals, weaving through early markets where merchants had already begun shouting, bargaining, laughing, and calling out as if that chaos itself was the fuel that powered the entire empire. Spice sellers scattered turmeric and nutmeg into the air, creating a warm scent like an invisible invitation. Blacksmiths hammered glowing iron, each strike echoing like the steel heartbeat of the city. And amid all that splendor, the strange began to reveal itself. Things that medieval travelers did not know whether to fear, to marvel at, or to kneel and thank the gods for allowing them the chance to witness. Right from the city gates, one could see the Varangian guards, towering like marble columns, carrying battle axes nearly as tall as a man. To the small travelers from Europe, they looked like warriors stepped out of Norse mythology, because in truth, they were Viking warriors serving the Byzantine emperor. To medieval minds, that was no different than saying the old gods of the north were now defending the most luxurious empire of the east. Some believed they were not human, but gate spirits, because their ice blue eyes were so cold that one could believe they might see straight through a person's soul. Farther in, the imperial gardens convinced travelers that they had wandered into a cursed world. Fountains with complex hydraulic mechanisms could activate on their own when someone approached, a technology so advanced that medieval people saw it as magic. Some even wrote in their journals that the lion statues could roar because the water pipes made them emit lifelike sounds. In an era when strange loud noises could be seen as omens of demons, seeing water flow from the mouths of bronze statues like living spirits was enough to send people running from the gardens. But nothing confused visitors more than the early Grand Bazaar. There they saw things so strange that they surpassed medieval imagination. Circus monkeys dressed in red cloaks, capable of mimicking human speech. Alchemists selling liquid glass, what we now call mercury. Fish from the Black Sea with long sword-like snouts, preserved on blocks of ice imported from Armenia. All of this was everyday life for the people of Constantinople. But to a medieval traveler, it was a treasure trove of wonders. Western pilgrims even claimed they saw men who could fly in the city. In truth, these were simply daredevils jumping from towers with wings made of silk, an early experiment in gliding. But at that time, no one could believe that a human being could hover even a few seconds in the air. To them, it was magic, heresy, or worse, a prank of the devil. If one continued deeper and into the city, they would encounter even stranger miracles. Physicians using scalpels to treat illness, scholars speaking of numbers no one understood, like negative numbers and rotational angles, or artisans creating paintings with depth using perspective techniques that much of Europe had never seen. Many even believed Constantinople could see the future, because everything they saw here was far beyond what existed in their own homelands. But the thing that most unsettled medieval people was not the technology, not the luxury, but the feeling that this city was too perfect. It was like an impregnable fortress, a world built of light, gold, and stone, too powerful, too vast, too organized for anyone to imagine it could ever fall. Some left the city believing they had witnessed a new Jerusalem. Others believed they had seen Babylon reborn. And then, just as the Pony Express once stood before the telegraph, Constantinople too was about to face something that would change its fate forever. But at that moment, with the sun high and the city so lively that it made people forget all fear, no one knew that far away, history was quietly preparing a great blow. A blow that would make the entire medieval world witness something more strange and more terrifying than any story before it.